I hope Phil's still in the room, because the thing that most excited me when I got into my hotel room was the highlighter pens. Have you come across your highlighter pens yet? Or maybe it's just they tracked out the fact that I'm a complete addict, and there they were. The W Hotel had got it right. And I think it was a great example of customization. So a little bit about the Future Foundation first. We're a global consumer insight and future trends consultancy. We do quantitative research in 25 markets around the globe. We have trend spotters in more than 40 countries, and we also have more than 2,000 what we call global brand manifestations. So what we're always looking for, and I think we've seen many great examples today, are brands and businesses who are getting it right, who are at the early stage of adoption, and we can all learn from what people are doing in any part of the globe. And I think there's an interesting concept here that we're developing, which is almost, if you like, a replacement to that idea of a sort of big unitary movement of globalization. And it sounds a bit intellectual and academic, and excuse me if it is, but it's an idea that we now have to think of the world as being under the influence of what we call international contemporaneity, which means that ideas, new inventions, innovations come from anywhere in the world, and that we can all learn from each other. And the speed that we can do that means that there's a trend is no longer coming from one direction and spreading, but is bouncing backwards and forwards and gaining acceleration from lots of different directions. So I think that's the way to think about it. And also recognizing increasingly that we can't get a view of what's going on now with the consumer, or indeed predict the future from any single source of information. That question was just raised there, that increasingly you have to think about it, we think about it as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle with many different pieces, that some of those will be quantitative data, others will be qualitatively sourced, others will be from experts. You'll be looking at what else is going on in your market, those brand manifestations. So there's no way that we can know everything, but we're always trying to put that puzzle together, create a picture, and tell a story. And our way of telling stories is through trends, which we hope with our clients. And we've got over 200 subscribers to our online trends service, many of whom are represented here in this room. We can be delivering what we call actionable insights, which is really not just the aha, but yes, I understand what I can do with that. And any future gazing, in my view, should be about better decision making. And just to give you a sort of quick overview of how we think about the future at the Future Foundation, and it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about and discussing, is that we have to recognize that, again, you know, the future isn't like that red carpet, much as we might like it to be, rolling out in front of us, into which we can swan into somehow a better world. But we have to understand that it's made up of things happening at different rates. So we actually have trends that we define. We've got over 70 trends that we work with, or ways of describing change that are happening at different rates, at different levels of society. So at the bottom rate, and this is where I'm going to start my story about women, which is almost like going backwards in order to come forward, is that we have to recognize that there are factors that mean that a lot of things can only change very slowly. We're talking about regulation, we're talking about customs, we're talking about cultural heritage, infrastructure, legislation. All of these factors will be both opportunities, but also in terms of the rapidity of change, they prove to be constraints. If we move up into the medium layer of change, this is when we're really looking at, and it's very important here to have historic data in order to be able to project forward how values, attitudes are going to be changing over the coming decades. And of course, liberalization and changing attitudes to women would fit into that category, and I'm also going to look at that. So we're sort of speeding up a bit. And it's interesting, because we used to put technology, I suppose, more in this medium category. We could see, you know, what was coming on stream and how it would be sweeping through populations over perhaps a course of a decade or 2 decades. But increasingly, and we've seen a lot of statistics today, with technology, that speed of uptake is becoming so much more rapid that we have to act on it ever more rapidly and more quickly in order to capitalize at the top layer. And this is another layer in which all brands and businesses need to be able to read the signals. That's part of the job of the insight professional, and the researcher, and translate those into the actionable insights, the understanding that says, yes, we can be ready to act on that. And the fast trends are about fashions, they're about fads. They are essentially, we have a trends laboratory, we call them in vitro trends, where we identify these. And then you have to question, well, how big is that going to be? Is this just something we're all talking about this year? So part of the trick then is to qualify those over time. And if they hang around long enough, and one of the things that we also can look at is how many of our clients are downloading each of the trends that we put online, and we begin to see which winners are going to be. And if they continue to be popular, then of course we have a chance to put them into quantitative research, and they become grown-up trends, if you like. They've moved out of the nursery into the secondary school of the medium-term trends, and we can keep an eye on them. So let's just start the story with what really matters in terms of the big drivers, the underlying factors of shaping lives, middle-class women across Asia. And I've done many studies about women. The first one was actually 16 years ago, a study in the UK for a Labour think tank called Tomorrow's Women. And I suppose the thing that strikes me most in just looking at the data and analysing the signs here for both now and in the future is how so many of the same challenges and contradictions face us all, wherever we are in the world. And the slowness of change in terms of access to all sorts of freedoms and opportunities, I think, is part of the story too. But out of all of the things I looked at, and I could have looked at violence against women, very high profile at the moment, and at the forefront of perhaps people's consciousness in this region, but it's not isolated. It's a global phenomenon. There are many parts of the world in which women face constant threat of physical violence. I could have looked at decline in maternal mortality or growth in rights property, many different measures, government statistics. If you want to delve into them, they're there. But the one that really makes a difference is the education that women receive in their lives and the opportunities that creates. It's inextricably linked, and again, lots of data to prove this, which I'm not going to show you, to greater economic participation, to later marriage, to fewer children, to better health, and ultimately to greater equality. So as you can see, the signs are very good. There's a constant, steady increase in layers of education, levels of education, but it's going to be slow. And I think one of the ways in which we've tried to bring this presentation to life is we've consulted our trend spotters on the streets in local markets. And here are just some of the comments that they've given us. And it's really, I think, a story of yes, but. There's still a bit of a but in the story about women's progress, middle-class women. So, of course, in Thailand, and I'll leave you mostly to read these, I'll just pick out some key points. Women are getting more freedom about choosing education and then a job. And also noticing, and I think this is a vital economic point that's quite often sort of overshadowed in the discussion about rights and opportunity, that actually for an economy to function to its full potential, you actually need your educated adults to have that opportunity to work. But then the buts. In China, where you'll find the highest female participation rates in the region, there is still a discrimination between the jobs that men and women can do. This idea that, some jobs are only allowed to men. There's a concern about women getting pregnant. So there is an only male sort of announcement in their recruitment. That's still allowed. And this comment from India, which I thought was fascinating, educated middle-class women are exploring these job opportunities. They can range from being a technology professional, radio DJs, aerobics instructor, fashion designer. However, and again, if you look at the statistics, it's not just in Asia, it's everywhere. The proportion of women at the very top can be minuscule, although I think you're doing rather better than other parts of the world at the moment. So, of course, in South Korea and also in Thailand, relatively recent elections of female prime ministers and premiers, I think, are pointing in an interesting way. I suppose the question we have to ask, and as I understand many are asking in South Korea, is this woman going to be, Park Geun-hye, going to be a feminist icon, or is she just proving that women can be as good as men and play the boys' game? So will she be investing her time and energy to make life easier for all women? And we look at the quote from our trend spotter in South Korea, and you can see that there's a long way to go. In fact, South Korea is 108 out of 135 in the World Economic Forum's Gender Equality Index. So despite great progress and great opportunity, there are many factors that still have to be overcome, and the biggest pressure and constraint is the assumption that many women, these women, will give up their jobs once they get married or give birth to a child. So this is the sort of beginning of a story of the contradiction. This is a slow, steady, underlying factor. We need to put our bets into educating women worldwide. And if you, again, you look at all of the charities, you look at what the UN talk about, UNICEF, you look at what Plan International are looking at, the emphasis always on more equality long term is about educating girls and giving them that opportunity to move into the workplace and to not completely avoid any kind of traditional role, but perhaps to have that more in perspective with other aspects of themselves. And the other thing, we're moving up the scale a bit here. We're looking at the liberalization of attitudes, so in my medium-term scale. And again, it's quite interesting to look at our data from across the world and look at the comparisons. And I think there's a bit of a health warning with all of these quantitative statistics, which is another part of that story about how do you get the real picture. Not least to say, and these, I'm just picking out some of the responses from the Asia region to highlight to you, but you know, there's also a fact, and this is part of our hypothesis that I think you'll find in your bags, that we've got a leaflet for our book, our forthcoming book, which we're calling The Big Lie, which is not to say that consumers lie in research, but there is a way in which people know what they ought to say. And I think in this area of gender equality and other issues, there's an even greater tendency for people in worlds and markets where they know, and men, this applies to you, I'm sure, they know what the right thing to say is, what the politically correct thing to say is, and therefore you don't necessarily get the real picture of what people actually think. So part of our hypothesis on the big lie is that actually we're all, both as consumers and as individuals living in society these days, we're quite conflicted about both the social norm, which is what we know we ought to be doing, and what our underlying true feelings are or motivations might be. So it's about how do you actually bring those together and recognize, you know, where we really are. So yes, people in this region can be much more honest about answering this question, which is a very sort of traditional gender split. Men should be responsible for earning a living and women raising children or taking care of the house. So there may be a lot more honesty in this region than you might find in other parts of the world, as well as the fact that we're in quite a rapid transition. And it's, you know, there are all sorts of aspects to it. So I was very taken by this advert, which was sent to us by our South Korean trend spotter. I was looking at the statistics, which are reflected in that headline there, that generally speaking, women in Asia spend between 2.5 and 5 times more minutes each day on unpaid domestic labor. So if you're feeling a bit tired, women, that's why, okay? But it's not as simple as that. And as I was saying earlier, I was talking to somebody, it's always very easy when you're talking about women and you know, how their lives are changing to come across as a bit of a male basher. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at it, time use data, what you tend to find in those households is that men are actually doing more paid labor outside of a household, and women are doing the unpaid, unrecognized, dare we say, unglamorous domestic labor within the household. So anyway, the point being in South Korea of this ad, I don't know if you recognize Won Bin, who's the actor, she was saying that the tendency now in ads is for home appliances, time-saving home appliances, is to have pretty men advertising these. Apparently this makes them more appealing to women. And I suppose the point is here that the time pressures are absolutely intense for middle-class professionals in Asia, people who want to get on. We've heard how important education is. In India, where the comment we had was the expectation is the family should prevail, but women also want a career. In Japan, women, many are choosing to marry later or not at all, staying single, because they don't want to lose their freedom or jobs. But generally speaking, what it means is that households with married partners and with children in particular, but middle-class households are intensely time-pressured. trying to get things done, wanting to fulfill themselves as consumers, wanting to explore their lives in all of these. So great contradictions. And I just picked this out because it's also the case that this is true for men as well. So in recognition of that, there's just some of our data here looking at people claiming to experience time pressure on an everyday basis. And actually, as you can see, in China, more men agree with that than women. You've got a very long working hours culture. We've disaggregated our data, which we can do for all of our questions. So the point is that in growing economies, in markets where more people want to consume and enjoy the freedoms of being consumers and having the holidays we were talking about, staying in lovely hotels, funding the education for their children, all the things that matter, the experience economy, participating fully in that, really means increasing numbers of women and, of course, men need to work more, earn more, and it impacts on both sides. It's not just about women, it's women and men suffering, women in particular, in some markets. And I suppose the other general observation from all of the studies I've done looking at the future of women in the past does highlight this important factor that what we're seeing actually is greater differences between women in the same society emerging. So there's been an interesting book called The Globalisation of Inequality recently, coming from France, Francois Bourguignon, who's highlighted this, if you like, the merging or the similarity of the middle classes across different countries, but a greater gap opening up as people at the top become more affluent. And we can see in China, who interestingly, China have produced 7 out of the top 10 female entrepreneurs, you know, at the same time as many of their colleagues and compatriots, females, are working incredibly long hours for not much money in the enormous burgeoning manufacturing industry. So I think picking up on Matthew's point and that question about sort of micropayments and what it can do from a social perspective is that we recognise, you know, that things are slow to change, and for many women, it's much more about family care. It's not just about children. It's also about care for elders. It's about creating the communities, maintaining the communities. And this image is just from one of the social business programs, of which there are many in India in particular, which are about empowering women to help other women further down the chain, if you like, a kind of frugal innovation. But I suppose the positive aspects of a story, and now we're sort of moving up into the faster moving trends, is of course the ballooning of the middle classes, that growth in middle class, is really bringing greater consumer freedom to many more women than we've ever seen in the past. So that's a positive side of a story, that women can express themselves, that we do have freedom, and they can choose whatever job they want, what they want to wear and where they go, and they can travel anywhere in the world. And these are comments from many of the different countries. But I suppose that question of what real female financial empowerment might actually look like is quite a challenge. Again, from South Korea, this idea of a bank account that's called Loving Wife, I suppose both recognises the power that women have traditionally, but perhaps not their new role in being sort of drivers of the economy. Yes, so financial control might be one thing, but is that real freedom? And how can that be empowered? So I suppose that's one of the questions. So I've got 3 trends, or 2.5 trends. As I said, we've got 70 trends that we work with. Most of them are global, and I've only been able to pick out a couple. I won't dwell on them, not least because I'm running out of time, but I think I've said the important things about women. But mobile living. And I suppose what's so interesting, if you look at the technology, so building on that point about education, building on the growth of the middle classes, we can see that the new technologies are equalising liberational technologies for women, that women can use them as much as men and getting many of the consumer advantages available. So it's a dynamic force for positive change and giving women a chance to achieve a better work-life balance, to advance in their workplace, and of course, and again, you might have different views on this, but to shop to their heart's content, wherever they are, 24 hours a day. And there are, I think, some interesting examples of that developing here in Singapore. Just to give you an idea of what we do with some of our global trends, is that we think about them on a trajectory, another long word, which is about where they're going to go in the future. Now, I'm not going to give you our forecast for this, but actually, despite all of the excitement and the wonder of the things that we've been hearing about today, we actually think mobile living is still in its early stages as a trend. As you can see, China and India are above where you would think they would be in the emerging, but they're not into the maturing stages yet. Our view will be that they'll be leapfrogging up that maturing arc, but we've got a long way to go on this trend. We're only at the beginning. And I think some of those augmented reality glasses and filming opportunities we saw earlier from Google will be part of it. And of course, mobiles will give us opportunity to achieve spaces for women. I mean, this app here on the top right is a great example of a related trend we call gamification, which brings personal recommendation, leisure time together with the fact you shake your phone and it recommends local eating places, particularly those with offers. And below the shelf, I think this must be the female equivalent to the Johnny Walker Lounge that we saw earlier, although I'm sure Diageo would say women are very welcome in the Johnny Walker Lounge. The shelf is a space created by Docomo for women to come and test out new products. It's curated. There are new things there for women to try out. And it's in a shopping centre, so again, that idea of a physical space. And the cashless society, I think this is an answer to one of the other questions. Everybody wants to own the interface with the consumer. So if PayPal are investing in cashless technology, so are Starbucks, so are Groupon. Actually, they're trying to cut out the money men altogether and the card services. They're just trying to get direct access to the customer information. And as a new book that's just come out saying who owns the future, again, that was another question we had. The answer is the people who know where the money's gone, the micropayments, and actually saying that we are moving into an economy of remembering every single thing that happens to us, and we call that total recall. But just to say, as we've heard earlier, this is a part of the world that's ahead in mobile payments, cashless society, and in the principle of international contemporaneity and frugal innovation. We have to see the developments here will spread to other parts of the world. And that's particularly important for women because where infrastructure and financial services are less available, so this becomes an important part. And I'm just going to say on my very last trend, and this won't be news to you, that looking beautiful is very important to Asian women. And this seems to be a contradiction, and this is the reason I picked this out. It's such a contradiction to the sort of underlying message of empowerment. But actually, in a world where women are less empowered, so their image, and we have a sociologist in the UK who's just written a very controversial book called Honey Money. She's from the LSE. And she argues that actually women have to invest more in their erotic capital and their appearance in order to gain power over men. And that's another way of, in the future, this shouldn't be so important. Lots of examples of how important appearance is. And the only point here on our trend trajectory here is that in many ways, Asia is further ahead than many of the other markets in the world on this perfection of the body trend. Many different examples. The key for advertisers and brands is to help women resolve the contradictions, to save them time, to make them feel better, to enable them to fulfill themselves on all of the different ways: family, work, body, health, everything. We want to achieve everything in our lives. And of course, they're going to be longer lives, so we need to think about the older consumer too. So that's the summary. I've been told to wrap up for about 2 minutes, and Martina's sitting looking at me, so I will stop. There's more about us. We have a leaflet about the book, which just highlights a big lie in your bags. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to hand over to Michelle Fro from Kimberly-Clark, who's going to pick up the story. Welcome to Michelle.